June 28, 1942, near the Don River, southern USSR. Midnight wind bends the tall grass into silver waves as a lone German sentry stands in a slit trench, rubbing his gloved hands together. The steppe is quiet, too quiet for his liking. His breath fogs in front of him. The moon hides behind clouds. The only sound is distant artillery rumbling like far-off thunder. Then he hears it, a soft wooden creak, a whisper of fabric, a faint rustling in the sky. He squints upward, but the night is pitch black. The searchlights sweep across the horizon in white arcs, trying to catch whatever is out there. He mutters to himself, adjusting the strap of his carabiner 98K rifle. "Maybe owls," he whispers. The dawn steppes have plenty. But then the sound comes again, closer this time. A gentle fluttering, like broomsticks sweeping through the air. His hand freezes. A second later, the first Soviet bomb falls. A thundering blast rips through a supply dump behind him. Flames rise instantly orange, hot, violent. Ammunition crates crack open in a chain of popping detonations. Officers shout. Sirens wail. The searchlights pivot wildly. The sentry drops to the ground as two more bombs whistle down from nowhere. And only then does he finally see them. Two tiny biplanes, barely more than wooden frames, and canvas skins dart across the blackness. No engine noise, no lights, just shadows gliding silently straight through the beams of German searchlights, so slowly and steadily that the gunners hesitate, unable to believe what they're looking at. "The witches!" someone shouts. "Die Nachthexen!" The night witches. It is the first time the Germans give name to the Soviet women aviators of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, a unit so improbable that many German officers dismissed early reports as hallucinations, because what they were seeing should not have been possible. The planes, Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes, were relics, little more than flying wagons designed in the 1,920 seconds for crop dusting. Their top speed could barely outrun a horse. Their engines rattled, their frames groaned, and their maximum bomb load was laughable compared with the Luftwaffe's sleek Ju 88 seconds or He 111 seconds. Yet in the darkness over the Eastern Front, these fragile biplanes seemed unstoppable. They came low. They came silently. They came again and again, all night long. And every one of them was flown by a woman. Hours earlier, before the bombs began to fall, the airfield at Seshcha had been alive with frantic preparations. The women of the 588th, barely in their 20s, some younger, hurried between aircraft with tools in hand, scarves tied around their hair, and faces smeared with engine oil. Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova, one of the regiment's most daring pilots, tightened the straps on her flight goggles as her mechanic shouted over the noise of engines sputtering to life. "Your left magneto still misfires," he warned. "It always misfires," she joked. "It keeps the plane humble." Ver, her navigator, a teenage girl named Marina, climbed into the rear cockpit with two canvas-wrapped bombs strapped to the fuselage. She tapped Popova on the shoulder. "All right," Marina said. "Let's go make someone miserable tonight." Popova laughed, but her eyes stayed sharp. She knew the stakes. German supply convoys had pushed closer to Soviet lines that week. Their artillery positions were grinding the Red Army down. If the 588th failed to disrupt them, Soviet infantry would pay the price at dawn. She looked around the airfield. Dozens of Po-2 seconds lined up like skeletal birds. Their wings flexed in the wind. Their engines coughed smoke. Mechanics, many of them barely out of school, tightened bolts, refilled fuel cans, patched bullet holes with whatever fabric they could find. This was the only all-female regiment in the entire Soviet Air Force. Pilots, navigators, ground crew, no exceptions. And they had to fight not just the Germans but their own commanders' skepticism. Male officers had laughed when the unit was formed, calling them little girls playing soldiers. But tonight, as Popova throttled forward and felt the wheels lift from the grass, she pushed those memories aside. The darkness swallowed her. Only the dim glow of her compass remained. Behind her, dozens of Po-2 seconds took to the sky slowly, lightly, like moths drifting toward a flame. As the biplanes approached the German lines, the women executed the tactic that would soon make them infamous. They cut their engines. The propellers sputtered, whirled, then stopped. Silence. The rush of the wind filled the cockpit. The moon flickered through clouds. Popova could hear her own heartbeat as the Po-2 glided like a falling leaf. Below her, the German camp was lit by faint lanterns and the orange glow of cigarette tips. She pressed her foot on the rudder, adjusting her descent. The wooden frame creaked quietly, the fabric wings vibrated. To German soldiers on the ground, the near-silent gliding made a strange sound like sweeping brooms or faint whispers. It unnerved them deeply, enough that they began calling the women the night witches. Popova leaned forward. Her eyes narrowed. She released the first bomb. A second later, an explosion erupted directly on a line of German trucks carrying shells to the front. She restarted her engine. The Po-2 shook violently, as it always did, but roared back to life. Flak bursts lit the sky around her, white puffs of deadly steel. Marina grabbed her shoulder. "They're aiming ahead of us." "They always aim ahead," Popova replied, "because they think we fly like real planes." She pulled the stick hard left. The Po-2 dipped into a tight, impossible turn, something a heavier aircraft could never attempt. The German gunners overshot entirely. More gliding runs followed. More bombs fell. More explosions lit the night. By dawn, the 588th Night Bombers had flown 8 missions each, sometimes more. Their clothes soaked in sweat, their fingers numb from cold, their faces streaked by soot and oil. They landed one by one back at their field, exhausted yet defiant. A mechanic approached Popova. "Did the bomb hold release this time?" "Mostly," she answered, hopping off the wing. "It only tried to kill me twice." They both laughed, but their laughter masked something else. A truth they all carried. Every night they flew felt like borrowed time. A single tracer round. A single burst of flak. A single mistake in the dark. And their fragile canvas airplane would burn like paper. Yet they kept going. Night after night. Mission after mission. Glide after glide. And soon, entire German battalions began reporting it. "We cannot sleep. We cannot rest. The witches come every night." The legend of the night witches had begun. October 8th, 1941. Moscow, USSR. Snowflakes drifted lazily past the darkened windows as Major Marina Raskova unfolded a map on the table. Air raid sirens howled somewhere in the distance, their mournful wail echoing between the stone buildings of the Soviet capital. Anti-aircraft guns boomed on the outskirts. The war was at the gates, but inside this cramped office of the People's Commissariat for Defense, the battle being fought was different. It was a battle over an idea. Raskova smoothed the map with one gloved hand. Her flight jacket creaked as she leaned over it, eyes glinting under the harsh overhead lamp. Across from her sat a pair of gray uniformed officers, their faces lined with exhaustion and skepticism. "You want," one of them said slowly, "an all-female air regiment. Combat, not training, not ferrying, bombing." "Yes," Raskova replied. The officer lifted his eyebrows. "Major, we barely have enough aircraft, barely enough fuel, barely enough men. You're asking us to give precious equipment to girls." Raskova's jaw tightened, but her voice remained calm. "I am asking you," she said, "to give aircraft to pilots. Some of them have more flight hours than your male cadets. Many of them wrote to me directly when the war started. They want to fight. They will not be satisfied filing paperwork in the rear. Outside, another dull thump sounded as German bombs fell on the outskirts of the city. The officers glanced briefly at the ceiling. Women belong in hospitals, one muttered. Not in the front line. Raskova tapped the map. On it, the red front line markers bent dangerously close to Moscow. German arrows stabbed toward the capital. Comrades, she said quietly, the front line is almost here. There is no safe place any longer. If we can fly, we fight. If we can carry a bomb, we drop it. She paused, then added, if we fail, the Germans will not spare us because we are women. Silence filled the room. Raskova wasn't just another officer. She was already a legend in Soviet aviation, a record-setting navigator whose long-distance flights had made newspaper headlines before the war. She had the ear of powerful people, including Stalin himself. And now, she was spending every ounce of that capital on one thing: women in combat cockpits. At last, one of the officers sighed. Very well, he said, rubbing his temples. We will authorize the formation of 3 women's aviation units. 1 for fighters, 1 for dive bombers. He tapped a spot on the paper. And 1 for night bombers. He looked up at her. Major Raskova, if this fails, it will be on your name. She did not flinch. It will not fail, she answered. December 1941. Engels Airfield. On the Volga River, a fierce wind blew across the frozen runway, turning every exposed bit of skin raw and red. Young women, bundled in oversized flight suits and fur-lined boots, trudged through snowdrifts toward a row of primitive barracks. Steam rose from their breath. Laughter and curses in Russian mixed in the air. This was the birthplace of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Some of the recruits had come from flying clubs, others from factories. A few had never been inside a cockpit before the war, but had begged, written letters, knocked on doors until someone relented. They were students, teachers, shop assistants, now suddenly cadets. Soviet regulations labeled them officially as a light night bomber regiment. But their supplies told another story. Their uniforms were often men's uniforms, several sizes too large. Belts had to be wrapped around them twice. Boots, stuffed with straw. Some even received men's underwear, hastily shoved across the supply table by embarrassed quartermasters. Their aircraft? Polikarpov U-2 biplanes, the same design, that would later be renamed Po-2. Raskova walked along the line of these aircraft one afternoon, her breath steaming as she examined their fragile frames. Wooden ribs, fabric skins, open cockpits with nothing but the barest metal tubes between pilot and ground. These were training planes, one mechanic said apologetically, patting a wing. Crop dusters, liaison aircraft. We had to scavenge parts from 3 wrecks to make one flyable. Nearby, a young pilot named Yevdokia Bershanskaya listened, her eyes narrowing. She'd been selected to command the new regiment at Raskova's recommendation. Bershanskaya turned to the mechanic. Can they carry bombs? He shrugged. We can fit 2 or 4 under the wings, maybe more if you don't mind rough landings. She smiled thinly. Then they'll do, she said, because they have to. Training at Engels was relentless. The women learned to navigate by stars and crude maps, to gauge distance by the flicker of village lights and the shape of rivers. They practiced takeoffs from rough fields, landings in near-total darkness, quick turnarounds with barely enough time to refuel and strap on new bombs. In one freezing classroom, a blackboard creaked as an instructor drew diagrams of enemy searchlight patterns and anti-aircraft batteries. If you fly straight, you die, he barked. If you fly predictably, you die. If you fly too high, you die. If you fly too low, he paused, chalk hovering in the air. You might live, but the trees won't like you. The women laughed, but it was a tight, nervous laughter. They knew the statistics. Night bombing was dangerous enough in strong, armored aircraft. In flimsy Po-2 seconds, it bordered on suicidal. Still, they trained. They practiced engine cuts, killing the motor mid-flight and gliding down into an imaginary target, then restarting the sputtering M11 engine before hitting the trees. They rehearsed communication between pilot and navigator, shouting over the wind as they leaned close in the open cockpits. Altitude, 50 meters. Target, ahead left, 200 meters. Watch the canal. Watch the tree line. Their fingers went numb. Their eyes burned. Their cheeks cracked from cold. At night, in the barracks, they shared stories. One girl confessed she still slept, clutching a stuffed toy from childhood. Another admitted she wrote a letter every week to her mother but never mailed it, afraid a delivery would mean she'd already died. On the wall, someone had drawn a rough broomstick with wings and a red star. Beneath it, a caption, "We'll sweep them from our skies." In the spring of 1942, Bershanskaya received the order they had been waiting for: deployment to the front. The women assembled on the flight line, snowmelt turning the airfield into a mud-slicked mess. Mechanics rushed between aircraft, hammering, patching fabric, tightening bolts with bare hands. The Po-2 seconds stood ready, or as ready as they would ever be. Bershanskaya climbed onto the wing of the lead aircraft and looked down at her pilots and navigators. Some were barely 18. Some had already buried friends. All of them stared up at her with a mixture of excitement and dread. "This regiment," she began, shouting over the wind, "was not supposed to exist. They said women couldn't fly combat. They said we'd be lucky to handle training aircraft, that you'd panic under fire, that you'd break under pressure." She let the words hang there. "Remember those voices," she continued, her eyes sweeping across them. "Remember every man who laughed at you, every commander who told you to go home and sew, every bureaucrat who lost your paperwork because this is no place for girls." Silence. A few fists clenched involuntarily. "Tonight," Bershanskaya said, "you will show them and the Germans exactly what women can do with a wooden biplane and a few bombs." Writing, a ripple of grim smiles moved through the crowd. "And one more thing," she added. "You're going to be flying so low that if you're not careful, you'll steal hats off German officers' heads. Do not bring me back any hats. Bring me back craters." They laughed this time not tightly, but openly, because now it felt real. This wasn't just an idea on Marina Raskova's desk, or a rumor in Moscow, or a line in an order book. It was a living, breathing regiment. It was them. They strapped on parachutes, old, repacked ones that they joked would probably fail anyway. They pulled their scarves tight and checked their goggles. They climbed into their Po-2 seconds, pilots in front, navigators behind, each cockpit a tiny island of fabric and metal in the vast steppe sky. Engines coughed and roared to life. The airfield lights were doused. One by one, the night witches rolled down the grass strip, lifted into the air, and vanished into the dark. They were headed toward the dawn front, toward German supply depots and artillery positions, toward the very units that would, within weeks, begin whispering about strange, broomstick-sounding planes that appeared out of nowhere and dropped bombs precisely where they hurt the most. They were headed toward history, and, whether they knew it yet or not, toward a reputation that would make even hardened Wehrmacht officers shudder when the night wind creaked and the searchlights swung wide across the sky. July 2nd, 1942. Near the dawn front, southern USSR. 2:17 hours. The night sky was a thick canvas of darkness, broken only by the faint glow of burning supply depots far in the distance. The smell of scorched oil drifted on the wind. Somewhere beyond the tree line, German machine gun nests clicked and rattled nervously alive with the knowledge that something was hunting them from above. Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova eased her Po-2 into a shallow climb, the wooden wings groaning in the cold night air. Behind her, Marina scanned the ground through the slit in her goggles, their breath clouded in front of them. Below them lay a sprawling German encampment. Trucks packed in tight rows, tents arranged around command posts, artillery lined up like steel teeth in the moonlight. Floodlights swept left and right, searching for shapes that should not be there. Popova nudged her controls, whispering to herself, "Just a little higher, just a little closer." The Po-2 rattled like an old wagon. It felt like every bolt might shake loose at any moment, but it climbed. Suddenly, something bright streaked past Popova's wingtip, a tracer round, then another. Then a whole bouquet of orange fire arced directly beneath them. Marina slammed a hand on Popova's shoulder. "They see us." Popova didn't need the reminder. The flak guns opened up in a thunderous roar. The night exploded in a chain of white bursts, blinding, violent, terrifying. "Hold on!" Popova shouted. She yanked the stick left. The Po-2 dipped sharply, its airframe vibrating with stress as it descended in a spiraling glide. The sound of rushing wind drowned out everything else. A burst of flak detonated so close that shrapnel tore through the upper wing, punching ragged holes through the fabric. The whole aircraft lurched sideways. Marina screamed, clutching the cockpit rim. "We're hit!" But Popova's voice was steady, almost eerily calm. "We can still glide. We'll use the holes to cool the air." Another explosion shook the air, a black puff lit by fire, a wave of heat. Below, German searchlights snapped on, slicing upward in columns of white brilliance. Marina's throat tightened. "They're locking beams!" Popova gritted her teeth. If two searchlights intersected on them, it was over. Every gun in the sector would fire blind into that cone of light until nothing could possibly survive. But the Po-2 had one advantage. It could turn sharper and slower than any other aircraft in the sky. Popova banked right, then sharply left, forcing the fragile biplane into a zigzag that would have ripped a heavier aircraft apart. The searchlight beams scrambled frantically, crisscrossing the sky but failing to pin them down. Then, silence. Popova cut the engine. The propeller sputtered, slowed, and died. The night swallowed them whole. Only the soft whisper of air over wings remained. The Po-2 glided like a ghost. Below, artillery shells flashed. German officers shouted orders in hoarse voices, trying to anticipate where the witches would strike next. Men pointed rifles upward, but the darkness absorbed everything. The women were invisible again. Marina leaned forward. "We're right over the target." Popova nodded. She could feel the tension humming through the aircraft like an electrical current. "Drop on my mark," Popova whispered. The Po-2 sailed silently above the camp. No engine, no prop noise, no warning. Marina's fingers rested on the bomb toggle. 3, 2, 1, now. A heavy thump jolted the aircraft as the bombs fell. Popova held her breath. The night hung still. Then, boom, a fireball erupted below. Then another. Then a third, as a line of trucks lit up like matches. Artillery shells cooked off in rapid succession, sending sparks high into the air. Popova restarted the engine, hammering the ignition until it finally coughed back to life. Marina shouted, "Go! Go! Go!" The Po-2 climbed away from the inferno, flames licking the sky behind them. But victory was short-lived. A second Po-2, flown by two of the regiment's youngest aviators, wasn't as lucky. As Popova turned for home, she spotted a burning streak falling from the sky, spiraling downward. A German searchlight held it in place like a pinned insect. "Xenia!" Marina exclaimed, recognizing the aircraft. Popova banked sharply, watching helplessly as the Po-2 crashed into a field and exploded in a flash of orange. A column of fire rose up. No parachutes, no survivors. "Damn it," Popova whispered, her voice breaking for the first time that night. The loss hit her harder than any shell could. Zhenya was only 19. Her navigator was barely 18. They had joked earlier that their tiny plane was held together with hope and patches. Now they were gone. As Popova turned away, she felt a hot sting behind her eyes. She would grieve later. Now she had to fly, Marina said softly. "We're not done tonight." Popova nodded. "No, we are not." 4:40 hours. Return to base. The sky was turning a pale gray as the Po-2 descended toward the airfield. Mechanics ran out with lanterns, guiding the battered biplanes home. When Popova and Marina climbed off their aircraft, their legs trembled. One mechanic stared at the holes torn through their wings. "How did you not fall out of the sky?" "Skill," Popova said. "Luck," Marina corrected. "Mostly stubbornness," Popova admitted, collapsing onto a fuel crate. As dawn broke over the steppe, the regiment gathered for roll call. Several names went unanswered. Bershinskaya stood in front of her pilots and navigators, her face carved from grief and iron. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She simply said, "Tonight, they hit us. Tomorrow, we hit them harder." The women nodded, exhausted but resolute. No one talked about quitting. No one asked for easier missions. No one dared suggest these losses were proof women didn't belong in combat. If anything, it hardened them, because now they knew exactly what the war would demand from them, and they were still willing to pay it. As Popova looked east, where the sun rose slowly over the Volga, she whispered, "We'll make them regret every searchlight they ever turned on us." August 15th, 1942, near Kotelnikovo, south of Stalingrad. 23 hours. Dust hung in the air like smoke, stirred by the movement of thousands of German troops preparing for yet another push toward the Volga. Tank engines growled in the dark. Mechanics hammered on armor plates. Horse-drawn wagons clattered past command tents. The whole region felt like a tightening noose, one the Germans believed would choke Stalingrad within weeks. But far above the plain, hidden in moonless blackness, a slow-moving shadow crept toward them on wooden wings. Lieutenant Popova leaned forward in her cockpit, eyes scanning for the faint outline of the railway line below. She could smell the sharp tang of petrol from the auxiliary cans strapped behind her seat. The Po-2 always reeked of it, especially after long flights. Her gloves were stiff with dried oil. Her scarf was pulled so tight against the cold that it pressed painfully into her jaw. Behind her, Marina wiped condensation from the glass of her navigator's board. "We're close," she said. "Very close." Popova exhaled. Engine, cut in 20 seconds. She counted down silently. As the seconds passed, they drifted over the first signs of the German advance. Long serpentines of light from vehicle convoys, the rhythmic thump of artillery, the faint glimmer of road dust glowing in the moonlight. And then she reached zero. She cut the engine. The familiar clack clack sputter died away, leaving them gliding on nothing but cold wind and courage. Below them sat one of the German Sixth Army's most essential logistical arteries, a railway line used to funnel fuel, ammunition, and food toward the spearhead of the Stalingrad offensive. If the Soviets could choke it even for one night, it would ripple across the entire front. But tonight was not like the others. Tonight, they were not just harassing. They were sabotaging the German timetable, and they were not doing it alone. Across the dark horizon, as Popova banked left to descend toward the railway junction, she saw them tiny silhouettes of other Po-2 seconds drifting like drifting black leaves on the wind. 18 aircraft, 36 women, the largest coordinated strike the regiment had attempted so far. Marina murmured through clenched teeth, "They'll never see us coming." "Das Plus." Popova's eyes narrowed. "That's the point." A signal flare arced upward from a distant cluster of trees, a marker fired by Soviet scouts operating on the ground. It was faint, barely more than a green spark against the vast darkness, but Popova spotted it instantly. "There's our target." A train had just rolled into the junction, an ammunition train. Perfect. Popova leveled the wings and whispered, "For Zhenya." Marina didn't ask if she meant the fallen pilot or all the others they had already lost. It didn't matter. The war didn't allow long explanations. Popova steadied the plane. Marina waited. The Po-2 passed over the northern end of the junction. Drop. Marina triggered the release. 2 bombs fell, slicing through the darkness, and struck the ground in a gout of orange flame. A second Po-2 dropped its load a moment later, then another. Explosions rippled down the railway line, each detonation sending shock waves of fire through fuel drums and ammunition crates. Suddenly, an enormous white flash lit the sky. One of the rail cars exploded in a spectacular chain reaction, sending a column of fire dozens of meters high. Burning debris rained down. German soldiers tore out of barracks, shouting in panic. And then the searchlights snapped on. "Popova!" Marina shouted. "They see us!" But Popova had already banked away. The Po-2 rolled gently, giving her a narrow view of what the Germans saw. Her aircraft slow, frail, fabric-skinned, floating almost peacefully between the beams of 2 converging searchlights. She muttered, "Not today." A burst of flak erupted just beneath them, the shock wave slamming into the biplane like a giant's fist. The Po-2 lurched wildly. Marina gripped the cockpit rim. They hit close. Popova fought the controls as the engine sputtered under the sudden jolt. "Restart! Restart!" Marina cried. Popova pumped the throttle. The M11 engine coughed, stuttered, and roared back to life. The searchlights swung after them, beams clawing through the dark. "What do we do?" Marina shouted. Popova's voice was level. "We do what we always do." She yanked the stick. The Po-2 rolled into a sharp turn, far sharper than any German gunner expected. The searchlights overshot, beams slicing uselessly into the sky. Below them, flak gunners cursed loudly enough that Popova could imagine the words. But the danger wasn't over. 2 German fighters, Bf 110 night fighters, had scrambled from a nearby airfield. Their engines howled through the darkness, hunting like wolves. Marina's eyes went wide. "Twin-engine fighters! They're coming right at us!" Popova looked behind them and saw the impossible. The fighters were already too close. "Hold on!" She pulled the Po-2 into a near stall, dropping the nose violently. The sudden fall robbed the German fighters of their firing angle. They thundered past overhead, overshooting their target by seconds. It was the only advantage the Po-2 truly had. Its speed, or lack of it. The German fighters circled back, but by then Popova had already vanished into the dark, engine throttled low, hugging the ground so closely that wheat stalks brushed against the landing gear. Marina let out a shaky breath. "They can't follow us this low," Popova smirked. "They can try." Behind them, the entire junction was ablaze. The night sky glowed orange, turning the horizon into a fiery wall, and for the first time, the German advance toward Stalingrad faltered, if only slightly. But even a slight disruption meant lives saved. 6-10 hours. Return to base. As dawn broke, mechanics rushed toward the returning Po-2 seconds. Some aircraft came in with bullet holes, some with torn fabric. One landed on a badly bent landing skid. But they all landed. Bershanskaya inspected the damage with folded arms. "This is the worst damage we've taken in a single night," one mechanic muttered. "This is the most damage we've inflicted," Bershanskaya responded calmly. Popova slid off her wing, her legs trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. Marina leaned on her shoulder as they walked toward the command tent. Inside, a small radio sat on a crate, crackling with intercepted German traffic. A young signaller looked up, pale, "You should hear what the Germans are saying," she said. She pressed the speaker closer. A scratchy German voice came through. "Unknown aircraft, moving too slowly to track, impossible to shoot down. Witches." Another voice overlapped it. "Nachthexen. They glide through the beams. They are not normal pilots." Popova and Marina exchanged a glance. Even the Germans were starting to understand the truth. They were not dealing with a conventional enemy. They were dealing with something strange, unpredictable, unrelenting, something that haunted the night. That evening, as the women filed into the mess tent, Popova overheard a mechanic whispering to a young pilot, "Be careful, this is going to get worse. The Germans are adapting." He wasn't wrong. More searchlight nets, more flak batteries, more night fighters. The Germans were terrified, but they were also learning. And that meant the night witches needed to evolve too. Popova sat down heavily with her cup of weak tea. Marina slid into the seat beside her, her face smudged with soot, her hair tangled from the night's chaos. Marina nudged her. "You all right?" Popova nodded slowly. "I'm just thinking." "About what?" Popova's voice was quiet. "Tonight was bad, but the next few weeks, they're going to be worse, much worse." Marina sipped her tea. "Then we fly better." Popova smiled faintly. "Yes, then we fly better." Outside, the sun rose over the steppe. The Germans would rebuild. The Soviets would prepare. The war would continue to grind its terrible path toward Stalingrad. But for now, the night witches rested briefly. They would be in the sky again soon. And the German soldiers who heard the faint whisper of fabric wings cutting through the night would once again look upward in fear. September 19th, 1942. Southwestern approaches to Stalingrad. 0:43 hours. A sickly yellow haze hung over the horizon, glowing with the fire of a city fighting for its life. Stalingrad burned its factories, its homes, its granaries, each blaze pushing smoke so thick it seemed to blot out the stars themselves. The Volga shimmered faintly beneath the moon, a black ribbon choked with drifting embers. Above this inferno, the Po-2 flown by Lieutenant Popova fought its way through turbulent air, buffeted by updrafts of hot wind rising from the city's shattered ruins. Marina wiped ash from her goggles. "Feels like we're flying over a furnace." "We are," Popova said, voice muted by the roar of the engine. "And we're about to dive right into it." Below them, the German Sixth Army hammered the Soviet defenders with artillery, rockets, and endless infantry assaults. Entire districts changed hands multiple times in a single day. At night, tracer rounds stitched the skyline like glowing scars. Somewhere beneath that chaos, Soviet scouts radioed coordinates of a new German mortar position firing toward the tractor factory district. That was their target. But tonight, something was different. The German defenses bristled with flak towers, newly installed near key supply lines feeding the Stalingrad siege. Searchlights had multiplied, and worst of all, night fighters, at least 3 of them, circling like hungry wolves. Marina leaned forward. "Those fighters will be all over us if we cut the engine too early." Popova's jaw tightened. "Then we won't cut it early." Marina blinked. "You want to glide from where? Over the city?" Popova nodded once. "The smoke will hide us, we hope." There were no perfect plans in Stalingrad, only necessary ones. As they approached the flaming city, a wall of black smoke swallowed the Po-2 whole. The sky vanished, the world shrank to a shaking cockpit, a crackling engine, and the smell of burning fuel from the fires below. Popova narrowed her eyes. She flew by instinct, now listening to the tremor of air over canvas, feeling the subtle shifts as the Po-2 passed through columns of heat. Marina coughed hard. "It's like breathing charcoal." Popova said nothing. She tightened her scarf and pushed onward. When they burst through the smoke again, the ground below erupted in bursts of artillery flashes. The German front line carved a jagged frontier through the ruined suburbs. In the distance, the tractor factory stood like a black skeleton of steel girders against the burning sky. A shell burst beneath them, shaking the Po-2 violently. Marina grabbed the map strapped to her knee. Target ahead, 200 meters past the rail spur. Popova scanned the skyline, searchlights crisscrossing, artillery booming, buildings collapsing in the distance. And then she saw it. A German mortar battery dug into the foundation of a ruined apartment block. Muzzles flashed in rapid, deadly rhythm aimed directly at Soviet defenders just a few hundred meters away. Each blast tore deeper into the factory district, where exhausted infantry desperately clung to rubble. Marina tapped her back. "Let's get them," Popova nodded. But their approach would not be simple. The Germans had learned. They knew the witch's tricks. As Popova prepared to dive, searchlights swept upward, their beams slicing through smoke and night. Marina's voice cracked. "They found us already." 4 beams locked together, forming a cone of blinding white that illuminated their tiny Po-2 like a fragile toy dangling in midair. And the flak guns opened up. The sky erupted in a hurricane of steel. Black bursts pulsed all around them, thumping shockwaves that shook the Po-2 so hard the wings flexed like thin wooden bows. Shrapnel hissed past the cockpit. A piece tore through Marina's map and flung paper scraps into the wind. Popova gritted her teeth. "Hold on." She pushed the stick forward, dropping the aircraft into a gut-wrenching dive. The world turned into a blur of fire and chaos. Flak bursts trailed behind them. The searchlights twisted desperately, losing their grip for a split second, which was all Popova needed. She killed the engine. Silence. Almost holy. Almost peaceful. The Po-2 glided through the beams in eerie stillness, slipping past the blinding light like a shadow. The night refused to surrender. Below, German soldiers shouted, pointing upward, but the aircraft had vanished from their aiming angles. Marina steadied herself. 10 seconds to drop. 8. 6. Popova kept the wings level. Marina released the bombs. They fell with perfect precision. Seconds later, a thunderous detonation engulfed the mortar battery. Gun crews were flung into the air. Ammunition crates exploded in bright white flashes. The entire foundation of the ruined building collapsed inward, burying what remained of the German emplacement. Marina pumped her fist. Direct hit, but Popova didn't smile, because she heard something else. A low, growing roar behind them. She glanced over her shoulder. Twin-engined Bf-110 night fighter and closing fast. "Marina!" she shouted. "Straps tight." Marina barely had time to respond before Popova yanked the Po-2 into a steep zigzag, the only maneuver their fragile plane could handle without tearing itself apart. The night fighter overshot but corrected quickly. Marina screamed, "They're coming again!" Popova pushed the Po-2 into a near hover stall. The nose rose sharply. The aircraft slowed to a crawl so slow that the German fighter lost lift trying to follow the same turn. The Bf-110 wobbled, tilted, then dropped altitude to recover. "They can't match us," Popova muttered, breathing hard. "We're too slow." Lakin. Also about a day. The fighter made a wide loop to try again, but by that time, Popova had slipped back into the cover of thick smoke columns rising from Stalingrad's burning districts. The night fighter gave up. Behind them, the flames of their bombing strike merged with the already infernal glow of the city. The sky trembled with constant artillery. Buildings collapsed in fresh detonations. And the women's Po-2 so silent, so small, flew above it all like a drifting ember. 3:30 hours. Temporary Soviet forward strip. The landing strip was nothing more than flattened steppe beside a line of poplar trees. A faint outline of trenches zigzagged toward the east. The rumble of the Stalingrad nightmare echoed even here. As Popova brought the Po-2 down, the wheels bounced hard on the uneven ground. Dust washed over them as they rolled to a stop. Ground crew ran out, lanterns swinging, helping Marina climb down. One medic rushed forward. "Are you injured? You inhaled a lot of smoke." Marina waved him away. "Later. We need to refuel first." Popova staggered off the wing. Her entire body shook from adrenaline and exhaustion. A mechanic looked at the shredded fabric on their upper wing and whistled. "You flew through hell tonight," he said. Popova managed a thin smile. "We do that often." But when she walked toward the mess tent for water, she passed a stretcher, one covered with a tarp. A pair of women stood over it, heads bowed. Their flight jackets were still zipped, their goggles hanging limply around their necks. Popova froze. "Who?" she asked quietly. One of the women looked up, tears streaking down her soot-stained cheeks. "Katya and Lena," she whispered. "Flak got them. Their plane, it didn't make it back." Popova's stomach twisted. Katya had been a new pilot. Lena, a navigator who made everyone laugh with terrible jokes, even in the darkest days. They had flown 3 missions that night. The 4th had been too much. Popova sank onto a crate, burying her face in her hands. Marina sat beside her. "We can't mourn every loss now," she murmured gently. "If we do, we won't be able to take off again." Popova whispered. "Maybe we need to mourn, even for a moment." Marina placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then mourn, and after that, we fly." Popova nodded, swallowing hard, because that was the truth of this war. If they didn't fly, someone else would die in their place, and Stalingrad demanded everything. That dawn, as the first pale light crept across the eastern steppe, the night witches prepared their aircraft again, patching holes with fresh fabric, refilling fuel cans, loading new bombs. The enemy was adapting. The danger was increasing. The casualties were mounting, but so was their resolve. They would take off again that night, and the next, until the Germans were driven from the city, or until there were no more planes left to fly. Because Stalingrad wasn't just a battle, it was a promise. A promise they made to every woman who didn't return. A promise they made to every soldier in the rubble below. A promise they made to themselves. They would endure, they would glide, they would strike, and the whisper of their wings would become a sound the Germans could never escape. December 3rd, 1942, near the frozen bend of the Don River, 11 hours. The steppe was a wasteland of ice, frosted grass, shattered like glass beneath the boots of ground crews. The air bit like metal on exposed skin. Every breath rose as a white cloud, and across this frozen emptiness, dozens of Po-2 biplanes sat in silence, thin skins stretched tight over wooden ribs, engines covered in quilts to keep them from freezing. A lantern flickered in the wind as Lieutenant Popova approached her aircraft. Snow crunched beneath her flight boots. Her scarf was pulled so tightly around her mouth that she could barely speak. Marina shuffled behind her, hugging her arms to her chest. "I can't feel my fingers," Popova nodded. "You don't need fingers to be brave," Marina groaned. "That's your pep talk?" Popova smiled weakly. "That's all I've got at 2 in the morning." They climbed into the cockpit, cold metal biting through their gloves. The engine groaned when the mechanic turned the crank. It coughed, sputtered, then died. Marina's shoulders slumped. "Not again." The mechanic tried a second time, and a third. Finally, with a choking roar, the M11 engine chugged to life, shaking the entire aircraft like a coughing animal. He looked up at Popova. "Don't turn it off," he warned. "If you cut the motor too long tonight, you'll never get it back." Popova nodded grimly. Cutting the engine was their trademark maneuver, the silent glide that made them terrifying ghosts to the Germans. But in winter, a stalled engine might freeze solid before it could restart, which meant The women would have to glide sparingly, or risk crashing into the icy steppe. "Let's hope the wind helps us," Marina muttered. Popova didn't answer. She eased the throttle forward, and the Po-2 lurched into motion. One by one, the night witches rose into the frozen dark. 2:58 hours. 15 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The sky felt heavier than summer nights, a dark vault pressing down. Clouds hid the moon. The Volga below was a jagged ribbon of ice. Fires flickered on the horizon where the battle for the city still raged. Marina checked her map. Fuel depot, west of the German 6th Army's supply corridor. Popova frowned. "That corridor is crawling with fighters." "Yes," Marina replied. "But it's also starving Stalingrad." Popova nodded. No more needed to be said. They descended. The cold wind knifed through the open cockpit. Popova felt her eyelashes freezing. The Po-2 shuddered violently as they approached the enemy line. Below, German headlights moved in long convoys toward Stalingrad. Tanks, trucks, and half-tracks crawled across the ice and snow, part of the desperate push to crush the last Soviet defenders before winter swallowed the front. Marina tapped Popova's shoulder. "We're close," Popova inhaled. "Ready?" Marina nodded. Popova cut the engine. The propeller spun down, blades slowing until they stopped completely. Silence swallowed them. The Po-2 glided through the dark, losing altitude slowly, drifting like a leaf falling through still air. Except the air wasn't still. A freezing gust caught the right wing, and the aircraft wobbled dangerously. "Easy," Popova whispered, coaxing the wooden bird back into control. Through her goggles, lights appeared on the ground lanterns arranged in a line. A depot, munitions crates piled high, trucks parked in neat rows, soldiers huddling around barrels of fire. Perfect. Then a searchlight snapped on. A blinding white beam swept across the snow. Marina hissed. Too early. Popova held the glide, unmoving, her breath locked in her chest. The beam passed beneath them, then swung away. Popova whispered, "Now." Marina dropped the bombs. They fell silently through the night. Then, kathoom! An enormous blast ripped through the depot. Flames roared upward as fuel drums ignited. Trucks burst apart in chains of orange fireballs. Ammunition cooked off in rapid succession, sending streaks of sparks across the ice. German soldiers shouted in confusion, and the searchlights swung upward like angry white claws. Popova restarted the engine, but nothing happened. She tried again. The engine wheezed, coughing like a dying animal. "Come on," she muttered desperately. She tried a third time. Nothing. Marina's voice cracked. "Popova fighters!" Popova glanced back. A pair of Bf 109 seconds rare nighttime hunters swooped over the burning depot, banking to pursue the fleeing witches. "Come on! Start!" Popova shouted. The engine coughed, then sputtered, then finally roared back to life, throwing icy air into their faces. Popova slammed the throttle forward, and the Po-2 shot ahead, if shot meant creeping forward slightly faster than a tractor. The German fighters closed rapidly. Marina gripped the fuselage. "They're too fast." Popova looked downward at the frozen Volga. She whispered, "Hold on." And dove. The Po-2 plunged toward the river, wind screaming past. Frost flew off the wings. Marina screamed something incoherent. Popova leveled the plane barely 20 meters above the ice, skimming forward so low that cracks and pressure ridges blurred beneath them. The German fighters followed, but their high-speed approach was too steep. One overshot entirely, missing the Po-2 by seconds. The other tried to follow their path, but nearly clipped its wingtip on an ice ridge and pulled up sharply to avoid crashing. "They can't fly this low in the dark," Marina gasped. Popova grinned. "But we can." The Po-2, slow and stable, hugged the river until the fighters were forced to break off. They vanished behind columns of smoke and flame. For 20 hours. Makeshift airfield east of the Volga. The landing strip was a frozen sheet of ground illuminated by a few flickering lanterns. Popova brought the Po-2 down carefully, wheels skidding across the icy surface before finally settling. Mechanics rushed forward, breath steaming, tools clinking. One looked at Popova and exclaimed, "You flew straight through hell." Popova climbed down from the cockpit, legs shaking violently. She didn't deny it. Couldn't. She could still hear the whoosh of the fighters behind her, still feel the cold air blasting her face, still see the ice rising toward her during the dive. Marina stumbled down beside her. "We dropped the bombs," she said numbly. "We hit the depot. It looked catastrophic. It needed to be," Popova replied quietly. Inside the command hut, Bershinskaya stood over a crude map of Stalingrad, lantern light casting tall shadows on the walls. A Soviet logistics officer pointed at the railway junction destroyed weeks earlier, then at the fuel depot they had just bombed, then at several lines of German logistics, now marked with thick black crosses, denoting disruption. "These strike patterns," he said, "are changing the tempo of the German advance. Every night they lose fuel. Every night they lose munitions. Every night the Sixth Army grows weaker." He looked at the exhausted, soot-covered women standing in the doorway. "You," he said, awe flickering in his voice, "are part of the reason Stalingrad is holding." Popova stared down at her gloves, still trembling. Marina nudged her. "See? We're not flying for nothing." But Popova didn't smile. Her voice was a whisper. "It's costing us too much." That night, they learned that another crew, Serafima and Liza, had been lost, shot down near the depot. Their Po-2 had crashed into a frozen ravine. Their bodies would not be recovered until spring. Marina's face crumpled. "Serafima taught me how to tie my scarf so it didn't freeze solid. And Liza, she had a joke for everything." Popova didn't speak. She simply embraced her navigator tightly, letting the cold silence wash over them both. When Marina finally stepped back, wiping her eyes, Popova looked toward the dark horizon. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice firming, "we fly again." "Of course we do," Marina whispered, because they knew something, now, something every German officer along the Don front was slowly learning to fear. The night witches did not stop, not for cold, not for flak, not for fighters, not for exhaustion. Every night, they rose. Every night, they glided. Every night, they struck. And winter only made them harder to kill. January 12th, 1943. The steppe north of Stalingrad. 2 hours. A blizzard swept across the frozen plains, turning the world into a swirling maelstrom of white. Snowflakes hammered the Po-2's fabric skin like thousands of tiny fists. The wind howled so fiercely that Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova could barely hear the engine, an unsettling silence that felt like the night itself was swallowing her aircraft whole. Marina, hunched low in the rear cockpit, shouted through chattering teeth, "Visibility is 0. I can't see anything." Popova's voice cracked. "Follow your instruments. Trust the glow." It was barely a glow, a dim, quivering light from her dashboard compass. A pale reflection off the drifting snow. The thin beam of a hand-held flashlight strapped to the cockpit frame. Below them, Stalingrad was locked in a frozen nightmare. German forces, now surrounded by the Soviet counteroffensive, were starving, freezing, desperate. Their supply lines had been severed, their airlift crippled, their men worn down by months of brutal street fighting. But they still held strong points, fortified positions that hammered Soviet infantry, attempting to tighten the encirclement. Tonight, the night witches would hit those strong points, even in a blizzard. Even when sane pilots would have stayed on the ground, because if they didn't fly, Soviet soldiers on the ground would die in the ruined streets by dawn. 1:27 hours. Near the northern German pocket, Popova lowered the Po-2, squinting through the swirling darkness. The ice wind stung her face like needles. The flight stick trembled violently in her hands. Marina leaned forward, scanning the ground through the fog of her own breath. I see. Shadows. Maybe trenches. Maybe a gun line. Popova adjusted altitude. We'll get closer. The Po-2 descended into the storm. Below them, faint orange flashes cut through the blizzard muzzle fire from German machine guns firing towards Soviet assault groups pushing through the snow-covered ruins. The city was still killing men, even as it froze them. Marina clutched her board. Target is right below. 40 meters. We won't get another pass. It's now or... A sudden burst of tracers slashed through the dark. Flak! Popova shouted. Green and red streaks cut through the blizzard, glowing like burning needles. A burst exploded off their left wing, rocking the Po-2 violently. Snow and shrapnel blasted across Popova's goggles, momentarily blinding her. She wiped them with the back of her glove. Marina, drop on my mark. The Po-2 drifted downward in an unsteady glide. Wind gusts shoved it sideways. Ice crusted the wing struts. The engine sputtered, coughing against the cold. Popova fought it with skill born from months of living in the sky. Mark! She shouted. Marina released the bombs into the blinding storm. For a moment, nothing happened. Just wind, snow, darkness. Then, boom. A blast erupted below them, then a second. Flames flared through the storm, briefly illuminating trenches, broken concrete pillars, and the silhouettes of soldiers diving for cover. The Po-2 lurched upward on a column of rising hot air from the explosion. Marina yelled, "We got them!" Popova didn't answer. She was staring at something else. Two dark shapes slicing through the storm. Fighters, she whispered. Again. 1:39 hours. Above the Volga ice, twin shapes emerged from the snow. Two Bf-109 night hunters weaving in sharp, predatory arcs. Their engines' roars cut through the blizzard like thunder. Marina screamed, "They're on us!" Popova banked sharply. The Po-2 dipped dangerously low. The river ice flashed beneath them blue-white, cracked, littered with frozen corpses and half-sunken boats. Tracer fire streaked past. The fighters were trying to box them in. Popova's mind raced. Fly high? Too slow, they'd be shredded. Fly straight? Suicide. Fly low? Insane. She chose insane. Hold tight, she shouted. She pushed the Po-2 downward, barely a few meters above the ice. Marina shrieked. Popova! Are you trying to kill us? Not unless they do it first. The Po-2 skimmed across the frozen river, so close that the landing gear almost scraped the uneven ice ridges. The snowstorm reduced visibility to almost nothing. The German fighters tried to follow, but their speed betrayed them. One dipped too low and had to jerk upward violently, nearly stalling. The other lost sight entirely in the whiteout. Popova darted their fragile aircraft into a narrow crack in the river's frozen banks, an ice canyon carved by shifting winter currents. The fighters couldn't follow. They overshot and vanished into the storm. Marina breathed out, shaky and hysterical. I thought you said we needed fingers. Too dight. Popova managed a breathless laugh. Maybe I was wrong. 250 hours. Return to forward field. The blizzard had worsened. Lanterns and headlights illuminated only swirling walls of white. Ground crew shouted orders no one could hear. The landing strip looked like a myth only guessed at by teams beating the snow with wooden poles. As Popova brought the Po-2 around for approach, the wheels bounced hard on a hidden snowdrift. The plane jerked sideways. Popova fought the controls, skidding through icy slush until the Po-2 came to a jolting stop. Marina sagged in her seat, shaking uncontrollably. A mechanic ran up, knocking ice off the wing with a broom. He stared at the battered aircraft, his expression stunned. "You flew in that?" Popova climbed down, her legs weak and stiff. "Yes." The mechanic shook his head. "You're all mad." Marina corrected him hoarsely. "We're all alive." The mechanic didn't argue. Inside a cramped wooden hut, the women warmed numb fingers over a stove that barely glowed. Tea boiled in a dented pot. Frost clung to the inside windows. Pilots sat shoulder to shoulder, steam rising from their hair and flight suits. Bershinskaya entered quietly. Her eyes scanned the room. "Everyone back?" A navigator spoke, voice trembling. "All but one." Tanya and Olya didn't return. A heavy silence fell. Bershinskaya nodded. "We'll look for them after sunrise. For now, rest." Popova lowered her head. Marina placed a hand on her arm. "We did what we had to," Marina murmured. Popova nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on the floor. She whispered, "How many more nights can we keep doing this?" Marina gave a small, weary smile. "Until it's over." February 2nd, 1943. Stalingrad. Soviet counter-offensive complete. 6th Army surrendered. The women stood outside their barracks, breath steaming in the morning air. A runner from headquarters had delivered the news only minutes before, shouting through tears of relief. The Germans had surrendered. The nightmare was over. For a long, silent moment, no one moved. Then Popova exhaled shakily, a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh. Marina embraced her tightly. "We lived long enough to see it," Popova whispered. And so many didn't. Around them, the night witches stood with bowed heads, honoring the fallen aviators lost to flak, fighters, weather, and the brutal randomness of war. Women who had flown into the night knowing each mission could be their last. Women who had faced steel cannons with wooden wings. Women who had flown slow planes against fast enemies. Women who had glided into hell again and again without hesitation. Years later, German POWs would still speak of those nights in trembling voices. "We heard them," one said. "Those whispering wings, like brooms brushing the air. We saw them drift through the searchlights. Impossible planes, flown by impossible women." Another added, "We could shoot at them, but we could not stop them." They would say the same name every time. Nachthexen, the night witches. Women who made the night their battlefield. Women who turned fear into a weapon. Women whose courage burned brighter than any spotlight trying to expose them. Their story did not end in 1943. They flew until 1945. They flew until the war was done. They flew until their wooden wings carried the weight of victory. And the whisper of those wings still echoes through history. A reminder that sometimes the most fragile machines are flown by the strongest hearts.